So, but we are going to get into some other stuff here. Now, I don't know, our numbers may be down a little bit from this morning, and I had this thought that maybe it's because I mentioned Canadian Tire. Maybe somebody thought, oh yeah, it's Saturday, I'm supposed to go to Canadian Tire. I don't know. But thanks for hanging in there. And so we're getting there. We got a couple more sessions, and we got some Q&A at the end. I want to talk a bit about our family tree. Anybody here into genealogy at all? When I was a kid, there was a time when I was kind of the one that was into that in my family, and I've known other people that have been into it quite a bit. And genealogy is something that appears to be kind of important in the Bible. You read a lot of it, right? We mentioned some in Genesis and then Chronicles and so on. And of course, in the nation of Israel, it was pretty important to be able to establish your genealogy so you could determine your inheritance. If you were a Levite, you had to be able to prove that in order to be able to be supported as a Levite and do that job. And of course, in the New Testament, we know that there are a couple different versions of the genealogy of Jesus. And there's different explanations there for, why there might be some differences in those two. But they're both genealogies of Jesus. One of them traces all the way back to Adam. Of course, we could take the other one that far back as well. But what's really important there is that Jesus is related to Adam, and so are we. Because Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. You understand the concept of kinsman redeemer from the book of Ruth, right? That's who Boaz was. He was a kinsman. He was able to redeem the property back for Ruth and Naomi because he was a kinsman. And the same word in Hebrew is used for redeemer in Isaiah, talking about the coming Messiah. And so Jesus is our redeemer because he's fully God, sinless. He can redeem us from our sins. He's our kinsman because he's related to Adam, as are we, right? And so very, very important that we're all related to Adam, and that so is Jesus. Now, if you've been paying attention, we all realize there's another idea about genealogy out there. There's the notion that we're all related to everything, going all the way back to a single-celled common ancestor, meaning we're related to lions and elephants and trees and dandelions and everything else, and that we're all somehow interconnected. And one of the outworkings of that is that means human beings aren't actually any more important than a dandelion or a bacteria. And we see people adopt that sort of a worldview from this kind of thinking. Now, part of that idea is this. Anybody ever see this thing? Seen an image like that? It's supposed to represent the notion of evolution from some ape-like ancestor up to being a human being. And then in between, there's supposed to be all of these what they call pre-human hominins, or cavemen, if you will, sort of transitional between an ape or an ape-like creature and Homo sapien, which is a modern human. And when I was in grade 11, we did a history class, and they talked to us about prehistory. Prehistory was supposed to be the period in time before anything was written down. Well, we know biblically there's no such thing as prehistory because our written history goes all the way back to creation. But we had this image on the wall in our history class. And we talked about some of these pre-human hominins as part of the class. One of the first projects I remember, first assignments we had in that class, is we were shown a picture of an area, like some sort of a site in Africa somewhere, or some kind of maybe a dig site, I don't know. But in this picture, we saw certain things. We saw a partial or a broken ostrich eggshell. We saw the remains of a campfire, it looked like. We saw some very human-like footprints, and there was an old kind of beat up little arrowhead. I don't know if you can see that very well. So these are some of the things that we were shown. And we were asked to act like paleontologists or archaeologists and say, okay, who was here? What were they like, and how long ago? Well, we had this on the wall. That affected our thinking. That affected the presuppositions we had about what this might have been. And so we started thinking in terms of, cavemen, Cro-Magnon, or some kind of pre-human something, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago. Well, it turns out what we were looking at in that picture was a picture of the remnants of a campsite of a group of sand people, or the Bushmen that you might have heard of. These are actual people that still live in Africa. They still live a very simple lifestyle. They hunt with bow and arrow. They live in these little camps and they move on. They're very nomadic, right? Nothing primitive, nothing pre-human, anything about these people, but our presuppositions of what we saw. And because of that image we had on the wall, we made some wrong assumptions. It turns out just a bunch of modern humans. Now, of course, biblically, we look at Genesis 1:27, and it tells us, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's a very different concept than being evolved out of a single-celled common ancestor, and we're just the same as the dandelion. We are created in God's own image, right? And we're given dominion over the rest of creation. So that's a very different idea. Further on in Genesis 2, it says, and the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. So in those couple of chapters, we find out God created the male and female. In chapter 2, we get an expansion on that. He created Adam first, then created Eve from the rib. And then further on, it says the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Right? That's very clear in Scripture, that Eve is the mother of all living. We're all descended from Adam and Eve, and theologically that's very, very important. Then we move on to the next chapter. It says, now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, right? You remember that part, right? Firstborn son. Then a little further on, 16 verses later, it says, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. What? Somebody earlier said, what the? Where's this wife come? Thank you. Where's this wife coming from? We just heard about Cain being born, and somewhere in there, we hear about Abel, right? And Cain's got a wife now. Like that, where did she come from? That's one of the big questions that skeptics have. And they'll tell you, this is one that disproves the Bible. They say, well, there's no way that Cain could have, there were other people around that were not related to Adam, or Cain married a sister or something, and that's not possible because A, God prohibited that, and B, we know there's biological issues with doing that and having children with a close relative. So how do we explain this kind of thing? Well, further on, we find out the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years. He had other sons and daughters. So there were clearly other sons and daughters born to Adam and Eve. How many of them we don't know. But Cain very likely married one of those, a sister, maybe a niece. Because there was an issue with the notion that there were other people around that were not related to Adam. Because remember I just talked about kinsman redeemer? Right? The Bible tells us that one day the universe as we know it is all going to get destroyed, burned up, rolled up like a scroll, right? And that means everything alive, everybody here is going to be subject to the judgment because of Adam's sin. But if you're not related to Adam, then you're not eligible for the redemption under the kinsman redeemer. So, and obviously the Bible says Eve is the mother of all living. So that's not a possibility. Meaning Cain had to have married a very close relative. So you got this moral problem. You see that in Leviticus. You're not supposed to go and have babies with a close relative. And then you got the biological problem. And why does the biological problem? Why do birth defects happen in this case? Well, we've talked about genetics a little bit already. You generally get two versions of a gene, one from mom, one from dad, and mutations happen which mess up some of those genes from time to time. And if you get two good copies of a gene, you're perfectly fine, everything's great. You could have one good copy and one bad copy, and the good copy acts as a backup, so you're still fine. It's when you get two mutated defective copies of a gene, that's when things go wrong, right? Which means you're getting one from mom and one from dad. Now, think about it this way. If you're getting your DNA from parents who already have very similar DNA, because maybe they're brother and sister, then that means the mutations are probably going to line up a lot more closely than if your parents had been married to people more distantly. We're all related. It's just how closely related we are. We're probably 432nd cousins, right? So marrying a close relative just ups the possibility of these mutations lining up, and that's why it becomes problematic. But now let's think about Cain's generation for a minute, right? We know about these mutations that happen as the DNA gets copied, and they get passed on. Some of them get passed on to next generations. They accumulate over time. Richard mentioned 100 to 300 new mutations per generation. So think back to the time of Cain. How many mutations do you suppose Adam and Eve had? Oh, that rule earlier about just yelling out, that still applies. How many do you suppose Cain's generation had? Probably very few out of the vastness of the human genome. So in other words, very little risk of having those mutations line up at that time. In fact, God didn't prohibit marrying a close relative until the time of Moses, which is about 2,500 years after creation, because it wasn't necessary. God's laws are they're practical. And some of them come into play only when it's necessary. I have 3 grandchildren. I can tell you that when my grandson was a little baby, we didn't have a whole lot of rules for him because he laid on the floor, he didn't do anything. Now he's a toddler. Yeah, y'all know what that means. It means gates are going up. It means thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not jump on the bed. Thou shalt not beat on the cat. All these things, right? They become necessary. And so it was most likely that as mutations accumulated over time, it became more risky for close relatives to marry. And so by the time of Moses came along, it's more likely that God said, okay, this is a little more dangerous now, especially for Israel, where they were supposed to marry within their own tribe, right? And so it's a practical law. And biologically speaking, it's still a good practice today to avoid marrying a close relative. Let's go back to this image, right? Has this idea, and we've mentioned this numerous times already, has this idea had any effect on the way people think? Certainly has. Dr. William Provine once said, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be completely dead. That's just all. That's going to be the end of me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either." What a joyful fellow. What a dismal outlook. Now, this guy apparently grew up in the church at one point in time. We don't know how much he believed at that point in time, but we know he studied evolutionary biology. He taught it for many years, and as far as we know, he died an atheist. And certainly the evolution teaching was a big part of that for him. So we go back to this image. I want to play a short video that kind of dissects this image a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some of it a little bit more later on. All right, let's see if this one works. Looking for the audio. How are we doing up there, guys?
You getting signal?
Okay, let's try that again. No. Okay. All right, take that skin. Just talk amongst yourselves for a minute. We'll be all right. Not happening. Not happening. That's too bad. Okay, you know what? I'm going to go through some of this anyway. So I think we'll just do that, and we'll just have to skip the video, I'm sorry to say. Now, go back to my grade 11 history class that I talked about. Now, in that video, he talks about proconsul, an ape-like ancestor, okay? When I was in grade 11, way back in the early 80s, you can do the math again if you want, they talked about Ramapithecus as being one of the earliest human ancestors coming out, evolving from an ape. Well, what I found out later is that Ramapithecus is actually just an extinct orangutan. Nothing pre-human, nothing evolved about it. Now, what bothered me is that I found out that scientists knew this by the early 80s. But in the school, it hadn't got there yet. So I learned the truth about Ramapithecus because I joined this ministry. There's a bunch of people I went to school with who probably still believe Ramapithecus was a human ancestor, because you don't usually get to hear the other side when they say, no, this isn't actually what we thought it was. That usually gets published on some back page of a journal nobody reads, and it's not front page news, so nobody knows about it. Here's another one you might have heard of. This was called Piltdown Man. Goes back to about 1910 or 12, somewhere around 1912. Now, what tends to happen with these pre-human hominins that get discovered is the bones are very fragmentary, right? You don't get a whole skeleton. You get maybe part of a skull, maybe a couple other bones, right? And then what they do is they take that and they surmise, they kind of use a little bit of imagination, I suppose, to say, well, this is what this may have been. Looks maybe like it could have been partly somewhere between ape and human. And somebody will usually publish a picture of what they think this fellow looked like, right? Based on the skull. Now, 40 years, people believe Piltdown Man was a pre-human ancestor. What they discovered, though, is that it was actually a hoax. Someone took the jawbone of an orangutan, fused it onto a skull of a human, dirtied it up, filed down the teeth, and for 40 years, people believed a lie. And so that means there was a bunch of people in that 40 years who maybe didn't find out that Piltdown Man was not actually a pre-human. Nebraska Man, same idea. Round about the same time, somebody talked about Nebraska Man, 1917. This was based on a single tooth that somebody found. And from that, somebody drew this picture. That's some imagination right there. Talk about your artistic license. Now, fortunately, this only lasted for 5 years. This was not a hoax, okay? But what it was is they discovered after a few years this was just a pig's tooth. So not a hoax, but a mistake. And again, there were probably people who lived their lives still believing Nebraska Man was a pre-human. Now, in case you think that sort of a mistake can't happen anymore, just a few years ago, there was something called Ushikawa Man. A couple of partial bones found in Japan, part of a tibia, part of a femur, and they came up with this idea of this Ushikawa Man, something like 129 to 774,000 years old was sort of the big date range they gave it. Well, after a little while, they realized that these bones actually belonged to a brown bear. Not a man at all, not a pig, all right? But these bones do tend to be very fragmentary and subject to interpretation, as we've talked about several times. For example, Homo habilis is supposed to be an ancient form of human, partly not fully Homo sapien, but it's been admitted that Homo habilis, also known as hardy man, there's a representation of what somebody thinks this may have looked like, somewhere between an ape-like creature and human. But the truth of it is, Homo habilis really is just a big jumble of different bones that really don't even belong together. A fellow named Ian Tattersall pointed out, Homo habilis is an all-embracing wastebasket species into which a whole variety of fossils could be conveniently swept. Right, so a bunch of different bones that don't really go together, put them all together, and it looks like something that might be pre-human, but there's nothing real about it at all. Homo erectus, you might have heard of. This is supposed to be, I think, close to 1 million years old. It's supposed to be a little taller than some of the others. And again, there's a representation. The Java man was one example. Peking man was another. And supposed to be relatively primitive, right? We hear about these pre-human hominins, and we figure, okay, they might look a little bit human, but they're pretty primitive. They probably don't speak, right? You know, they carry around a club and things like that. Well, what tends to happen with these is more research gets done. We find more remains. We find more artifacts and things that from archaeological digs that are associated with them, and we find out things about them. Like, for example, Homo erectus was able to build boats and sail. Right? We discovered it had a pretty good-sized brain cavity. There's a number of things that we've learned about Homo erectus that tell us that really they were just human. Maybe looked a tiny bit different, but they're just human. Here's one of the favorites, Neanderthal. Who's heard of Neanderthals? That used to be a slur, right? People used to say, if you wanted to call somebody dumb, brutish, or stupid, you call them a Neanderthal, right? And that was the idea. Back in the 1800s, they found these remains. Some of them had this sloped brow in the skull, right? This idea was supposed to indicate that they're kind of slow, maybe not fully human. They're kind of dull and stupid, and they would be represented by pictures like this, very hairy, probably stooped over a little bit, speaking with grunts and nothing else. But we found out more about Neanderthal over time. Right, as we discover they were able to use fire. They were able to make shelters. They didn't just live in caves. They also make shelters out of wood and so on. They made jewelry. They had a burial ritual, apparently. They had, and human language. They had a hyoid bone, which is consistent with being able to speak. And they were able to hunt strategically in groups. They made musical instruments. They bred with modern humans. How do we know this? Because of DNA studies. Europeans and Asians have anywhere from 1% to 4% Neanderthal DNA. You can't breed with something that's of a different species. I heard about this lady who did one of those Ancestry.com things, found out she had some Neanderthal DNA. She went over the cliff, man. She was just... Because of everything she'd ever heard of Neanderthals, she said, no way, I'm related to an ape man here. No, you're related to somebody that is essentially human, that has all of these human traits. And the more we find out about Neanderthal, the more we begin to realize that Neanderthal really were just humans. They didn't all have the sloped brow, for example. And now if you see a representation of Neanderthal, he's probably going to look a little more like that. Kind of rugged looking still, but you know, if you give that guy a shave, put a suit on him, put him on the bus, nobody would blink. Just look like a dude, right? Maybe you know somebody that looks like this, you know. Now, there were some female and child Neanderthal remains found, and they did some computer imaging on them. And they gave pictures of what they thought these would look like. So they did with this a Neanderthal woman who they called Wilma. And she came out looking like this. This is what the child looked like. These are supposed to be Neanderthals. These are supposed to be pre-humans. No, these look pretty human. Oh, by the way, talk about that sloped brow. Be careful. There's a guy named Nikolai Valuev. He's a member of Russian parliament, used to be a Russian boxing champion. He stands 7'1". He's a big boy. Look at that brow he's got. Look at that forehead. I dare you to call him a Neanderthal. fellow by the name of Clive Finlayson pointed out, he said, the irony is that the scientific community is going to have to come around to the acceptance that the Denisovans and the Neanderthals also belong to the species which we call Homo sapiens. Denisovans is another supposed pre-human hominin, which, as far as we can tell, they're just humans. A few little differences. You know, those first Neanderthal remains, by the way, that they found with the sloped brow, they figure they probably had rickets that affected the shape of the skull and their bones and so forth. So a lot of suppositions get made about these fragmentary remains. And if you go out there looking for something that is a transition between an ape-like ancestor and a human being, you stand a better chance of finding something because it's going to look that way to you. You know, you're probably going to end up interpreting it a certain way. How about this one? Australopithecus afarensis. Repeat after me. I love this too. You guys are better than any group at these words. All right, you might know this one as the first specimen, the famous Lucy, found in 1974 by Donald Johanson. This diminutive little 3-foot ape-like creature, and it was called Lucy. I won't get into that story, but very ape-like, and based on the remains, they put out representations of this. There's a statue that the Smithsonian put up looking like this. A little ape-like creature going along. I think she's got blue eyes, going along, composing poetry in her mind, you know, and take a look at the feet. They're very human-like feet, and she's walking upright. They're kind of like hobbit feet, right? Human, but a little hairy. That's about it. Well, the reality is they never found Lucy's feet. Wasn't part of those original remains. Right? So why did they decide that Lucy had human-like feet? Why did they decide that Lucy walked upright? Couple of reasons. One is around the same time, some other paleontologists found some footprints 1,000 miles away in Lake Tolly, very human-like footprints, but they were found in volcanic ash that was dated at a little over 3 million years old. Now, the reasoning was that weren't any humans around as far as evolutionary history goes. No humans around 3 million years ago. Therefore, those couldn't be human footprints. Well, maybe Lucy made those footprints, even though they're 1,000 miles away. So here's the reasoning. Here's the fragmentary remains for Lucy. We find these footprints, we put those together, and we get this. Now, since then, they found Lucy's feet, or they found feet of this afarensis, okay? And they don't look like human feet. They found some other things too. Now, the other reason they thought that Lucy might have walked upright is because of the hip bones. Ape hip bones and human hip bones are very different. They're shaped differently because if you notice, apes tend to walk kind of like this. So you need your hips shaped a little differently than for humans to walk upright. Well, Lucy's hip bones were kind of crushed a little bit, so they had to do some reconstruction, which meant they had kind of a choice whether to reconstruct them like human hip bones or like ape-like hip bones. Guess which one they picked? And was that supposed to be the way it was? Nobody knows, right? Now, later on, somebody examined Lucy's original remains after a number of years, and they discovered this little bone that actually belonged to a baboon. Shouldn't have been in there at all. We've since learned that Lucy had a locking wrist bone, which is consistent with knuckle walkers, and all kinds of other features of Lucy that are consistent with an ape, not a human. What tends to happen with these pre-human hominins over time is more research shows that they're either fully ape or they're fully human. Maybe you heard of Homo naledi. Not a lot to say about Homo naledi, not really much of a difference here, other than, some of them had fingers that looked like they were curved just a little bit. So somebody said, oh, maybe they're, a little bit, mostly human, but still a little bit ape. The remarkable thing about Homo naledi is where they found them in this cave system. Where you see how narrow those little corridors are? Those are places I would never go. Those are really tiny. And so probably one of the biggest mysteries here is how did those remains get there and why? Was it a burial site? Did they get washed in there by water? Nobody really knows. But somebody did go in there and they found these remains. Here's an example of one of the skulls. Pieces of it missing as usual. Here's a representation of what they thought Homo naledi may have looked like. And here's one from a Homo naledi's child. Now, you notice the brown parts, that's the bones that they found. The black, that's the reconstruction. Little imagination there based on other skulls and so on. But really not a whole lot to say about Homo naledi other than, as far as we can tell, they were also humans. And then there's Homo sapiens, right? You know about them, modern humans, right? And you can find a Homo sapien skull, do a reconstruction, and you get something like that, right? I don't know if that's exactly how his skull looks, but you get the idea. And Homo sapiens have been dated as far back as 200,000, maybe 300,000 years ago. Some remains were found in Israel that were dated quite a ways back, farther back than anybody thought Homo sapiens would have been in Israel. Right? Of course, biblically speaking, we understand Homo sapiens been in Israel for a long, long time. Right? Not millions of years or hundreds of thousands, but you get the idea. Here's Ian Tattersall again. He said, even allowing for the poor record we have of our close extinct kin, Homo sapiens appear as distinct and unprecedented. There is certainly no evidence to support the notion that we gradually became who we inherently are over an extended period in either the physical or intellectual sense. Since there's no evidence that we evolved, essentially, in so many words. There's a fellow named Bernard Wood. He said, there is a popular image of human evolution that you'll find all over the place. On the left of the picture, there's an ape. On the right, a man. Between the two is a succession of figures that become ever more like humans. It's such a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go, but it's an illusion. He's talking about that. What we know from further research is that those in-betweens don't exist. Some evolutionists will place some of those on side branches, but there's no evidence that of any actual missing links in between an ape-like creature and human beings. Maybe at some point you heard the notion that chimps and humans have DNA that's 98 or 99% similar, right? And that the idea being, well, then that means it's because we have a common ancestor. Well, as Richard pointed out earlier, it could also mean we have a common designer. That if you got 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 feet, then you're probably going to have similar DNA to another creature who has similar parts, right? But that 98% is an early number, and it's been refuted since then. It was based on early research that didn't look at the whole genome. More comprehensive studies have been done. Initially, they found there was probably at least a 5% difference. And then recently, in 2018, a study done by Richard Buggs came up with 84.38% similarity. That's quite a bit less than 98. Another study done completely independently came up with a very, very close number. Well, that's a 15% difference is a lot, not more than 1 or 2%. Of course, even 1 or 2% would be huge when you consider the size of the human genome and how many of those beneficial mutations you'd have to have in order to get from an ape-like creature to a human being. Just hasn't been enough time for any of that to happen. Go back to what the Bible tells us in Acts 17:26. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Go back to this image again. I'm going to get into a topic that's a little bit touchy. This image is derived from Time Life books, something that was put out back in the 1960s. Showed a much more comprehensive idea of somebody's notion of the lineage from ape-like creatures to humans. And the unfortunate thing with this image that they showed is that they seem to indicate that some people groups were evolved from different types of ape-like hominins, some of them more primitive than others. And so what that meant was that some people groups were essentially more evolved than others. And that's an idea that actually goes way back to Charles Darwin. If you take a look at the full title of his book, On the Origin of a Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, Darwin believed there were such a thing as favored races. Because the idea back then, which they don't talk about anymore, was that people evolved from different groups and some were more evolved than others. Now here's a headline that was put out in 1906. It illustrates a little bit of what was going on back then. Bushman shares a cage with Bronx Park apes. Some laugh over his antics, but many are not pleased, from 1906. They weren't pleased because this was an actual human being that was put in a cage with an orangutan. Oda Benga, a pygmy from the Belgian Congo, brought to America, put on display in the zoo because somebody thought he wasn't quite fully human. That was considered science for a while. Here's something Darwin wrote. At some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. He believed Europeans were more evolved than Africans or Australian Aborigines. Thomas Huxley said, no rational man cognizant of the facts believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior, of the white man. See, this is a nasty part of evolutionary history that nobody wants to talk about anymore, and I don't know if hardly anybody thinks this way anymore, but it took a long time to go away, and maybe it hasn't completely gone away everywhere. And I'm not here to suggest that all racism comes out of evolutionary thought. People have always had reasons or excuses why they would, look down on other people groups. In some cases, even misunderstandings of Scripture. But evolution sort of added fuel to the fire. Stephen Jay Gould said this, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary history. Suddenly it became scientific and therefore somehow acceptable. But we know different than that. We can look to DNA. Oh, sorry, here's another example of somebody who didn't totally let go of this idea. I live close to London, Ontario, where there's a university. Back in the 80s, a guy named Philip Rushton published a paper that was really controversial. And here's somebody commenting on that research. He said, using 60 different measures, Rushton ranks the races along an evolutionary scale with blacks at the bottom and Asians at the top. You can see why people got upset. I'm not sure, he may have had to go into hiding and change his phone number. I don't know. But we do see this tremendous diversity. Now we know that everybody comes from Adam and Eve, right? That's the biblical model. So how is this possible? Well, here's an article we had in our magazine a few years back. You take a look at those mom and dad with a pair of twins. They're twins. Somebody once asked if they were identical twins. Well, no, obviously not. But they are twins. The whole point of the article was to explain where did the skin shades come from. And it all has to do with melanin. It's a pigment. We've all got it. You got a little bit, you got a lot, somewhere in between. And like we've already pointed out, you get two versions of every gene, right? And so it's possible for somebody to have a version of the gene that says make a lot of melanin, so dark skin, or make very little melanin, so light skin. And so here's what mom and dad have. And this Punnett square here sort of illustrates the number of different variations that can come just from having those 4 variations available, just in one generation. You can imagine the variation possible from all of the DNA information front-loaded into Adam and Eve. There's the little girls when they were 9 or 10. I think they're around their 20s now. What we know from DNA is there's very, very little variation in the DNA. There's 0.2% variation in the DNA of any 2 human beings in the world, despite how different we might look. And out of that, only 6% has anything to do with skin shade. That is a very tiny percentage of DNA difference. And yet, it's kind of obvious, and so people tend to make kind of a big deal about it. But we understand biblically. Here's an interesting quote. It says, scientists at the National Institutes of Health recently announced that they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome, and the researchers had unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. I love it when science catches up to the Bible. We've known this for a long time. So how do we understand this biblically in terms of biblical history? The different people groups, right? Go back to Genesis 11. First couple of verses says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Noah's descendants, his generation, the next generations after that, they all settled in one area. They built this tower to say, basically, we don't need God. They didn't spread out like God told them to do. So further down it says, the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So you've got this group of people, we're not sure how many, relatively small group, I suppose, after about 100 years after the flood, by one estimate. And they're all intermarrying, and so they're sharing DNA information back and forth. And it's possible that maybe they all had middle brown colored skin because of all of that swapping of DNA. But something happens when you take a smallish group and then split it into even smaller groups. Modern genetics shows that when a large, freely interbreeding group is suddenly broken into many smaller groups, which from then on breed only among themselves, different characteristics will arrive very rapidly. And this happens in all different species. If you have a population of dogs, split them up, the differences are going to arise very quickly when they start to interbreed only within those groups. And so in terms of people, you get all these different people groups spread out. If we take a look at the whole timeline here, you've got Adam and Eve. They got sons and daughters and grandchildren over time. And eventually you're down to just Noah and his family getting off the ark. And they've got probably still quite a bit of genetic information in their genomes. From there, you get their descendants down to their grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. The Tower of Babel happens, and that group of people gets split up, and the differences start to arise. Wouldn't be unlikely that some groups would maybe have more melanin amongst their population than others. Whereas some of the ones that had less melanin, maybe, they were left out over time. And then another population, maybe they had mostly less melanin, right? And so you get this kind of diversity going on. Now, it turns out that melanin, by the way, has the advantage of shielding us from UV rays. So having a lot of melanin in a place that's really got a lot of harsh sunlight, that's a good deal. It also blocks out vitamin D from the sun. So if you're in a place where there's less sunlight, like somewhere in the north, having less melanin isn't a bad idea. I'll let you figure that one out on your own, carry that through to conclusion. You can understand how you might have people groups in some areas with darker skin because it's a survival advantage, if you will. Other areas, it may make more sense to have less melanin. And so you get these different people groups, but we're all related to Adam and Eve. Richard already touched on this, the table of nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood, after Babel specifically. He showed you a map earlier, giving you an idea from Genesis 10, roughly where some of those people groups went, and he mentioned that we can track the lineage from there, that some of those names correspond to other names further down in history, like Moscow, Egypt, and so forth. And we can look at some of those names, place names, some of those nationalities, and we could sort of track that back to those generations that were separated, the grandchildren of Noah, if you will. Something rather interesting here. You see that word Iran coming in there in a couple of different spots. Descended from Shem, descended from Japheth, and then this other word, Aryan, which is very similar to Iran. You notice that the word Aryan comes in under Shem, a Semite. I think that would be a little bit of a surprise to this guy who wanted to build the perfect Aryan race, who he believed had nothing to do with Semites. He might be a little surprised at that. In fact, we can look into ancient DNA and we find probably a lot of surprising things about our ancestry that we didn't expect. Now, I want to finish off by talking a little bit about language. One thing that separates humans apart from any other creature is the ability to speak and to converse, right? We can make sentences. We have a really complex way of communicating with one another. But according to evolution, we are supposed to have developed that slowly from an ape-like system of gestures and grunts and so on, a little bit of a system of communication, but nothing close to the sophisticated system that humans have. Somehow that was supposed to evolve. Nobody knows how that's even possible. Noam Chomsky, a linguist amongst other things, he said, the deepest structures of language are innate, not learned. We are all born with the same fundamental grammar hardwired into our brains, and we are pre-programmed to pick up the additional rules of the local language. I'm not sure this guy's actually a creationist, but he's talking about pre-programming here. Not something evolved from a grunt and a gesture and so on. There's a pre-programming. You take a human being and plunk them down anywhere, and they can learn whatever the language is that's around them. Could be a spoken language, it could be sign language, but they'll learn it. They'll learn all the rules. Geneticist Luigi Cavalli Sforza, how did I do with that name? He said, children are born with the propensity and ability to learn a language. It requires a precise anatomical and neurological foundation. So we talk about this, we apply this evolutionary tree. Richard touched on this last night. The idea is that amongst evolutionists is you start with this single proto-language that comes from ape-like creatures, very simple, and it branches out into all the languages that we know of today. But the reality is that there's about 20 or so language families. Families of languages where within that family, the languages are all very similar, right? If you learn Latin, there's a number of other European languages you can learn very easily because they're related. But then they're very different, however, from other language families. Compare English and French to Japanese, for example, very different. So there's no similarity between these language families, but there's similarity within them. And biblically speaking, we can say that's consistent with what the Bible tells us, that all men had one language and one speech until God confused their language. We don't know exactly how many language groups. The number of language families now is a little uncertain, depending on how you count them. But it's very consistent with that history. We don't know what that language was before Babel. We don't know what language Noah spoke, for example. But we know that after Babel, there were several different ones. And you can see where different other languages would come into being slowly over time within those families. Similar to one another, but somewhat different. And here's the other interesting thing about language. If evolution is true, language should get more sophisticated and more complex as it goes on. It actually goes the other way. Try reading a book from 200 years ago. My wife and I started reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. The vocabulary in there is intense. She's got sentences that are this long. As we go back in time, we find that English and other languages were much more complex and sophisticated in the past. They tend to get simpler as we go along. You don't believe me? Read a text from your kid. Right? Some of you get that. All right. Right, that's the way it goes. So it runs contrary to what evolution would predict. Here's Sforza again. He says, most language families appear to have developed during a brief period between 6,000 and 25,000 years ago. Now, we disagree a little bit on the timeline there, but interesting that he's talking about these language families. Another fellow said, the evolution of language as such has never been demonstrated, and the inherent equality of all languages must be maintained on present evidence. In other words, no real evidence that language has evolved. Go back to the Bible. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. We certainly see that. Tremendous diversity in our world. All of us loved by God, created by God, descended from Adam and Eve. And we've said this many times already. We are to be prepared when people start to question us about things. Could have something to do with Neanderthal. Somebody does the ancestry test and they begin to wonder, what's going on here? What about all these ape men? I've come to the conclusion that many people believe evolution on the basis of something they learned in high school many years ago that's since been refuted, but they don't know it. Like Ramapithecus, for example. We do have resources in this area. Contested Bones is an excellent book examining the remains of all these so-called hominins, Neanderthal, Lucy, Erectus, and so forth. There's a DVD out there called Icons of Evolution, Lucy and Friends. You can learn there about what they did, how they reconstructed Lucy's hips and what that led to, and many other things. Ancient DNA. Want to learn some surprising things about ancient DNA from one of our scientists who's studying genetics. Lots of interesting information in there. And if you want to look a little deeper into the connection between this old evolutionary thought and the way they thought and how Hitler and other people started to apply that to their culture, evolution and the Holocaust kind of gives you an idea of how that thinking sort of developed over time. And we've talked about Creation Magazine quite a bit. We also have a technical journal. If anybody really wants the super technical stuff and the long equations, we have the Journal of Creation. This is a term subscription, 1, 2, 3 years, and it's digital only. But if that's the sort of information you're interested, you can inquire at the table. And of course, there's that Creation Answers book we keep talking about that answers over 60 of the most asked questions. And don't forget Creation Magazine. As Richard said, just get the magazine. And then there's the website.